Hello and welcome to In Their Shoes, Perspectives on Spending Decisions Made by Americans Living in Poverty. It's part of the webinar series for AmeriCorps VISTA members. I'm Andy King, a training specialist with the AmeriCorps VISTA program, and I'll be your host. Let's take a look at the goals for this session. By the end of the presentation, we hope that you'll be able to describe how the spending patterns of SNAP households compare to those of other households. We want you to be able to look at common decisions from the perspectives of people living in poverty, and then to see how certain choices may make sense given the options that are available to them. Additionally, we want you to be able to connect to the perspectives of people living in poverty and connect those to the anti-poverty programming that you're developing as part of your VISTA service. And finally, we hope that you'll be able to identify ways that you can provide better support and services to people who are experiencing poverty as part of your VISTA project. Also, if you did not do so already, you may want to go ahead and download the handouts for this webinar. It includes the slides from the presentation as well as a list of resources that we're going to talk about. I will say, and you can see the link there in the chat. I will say that the resources cited during the presentation are included in the handouts along with some others that are available if you want to go for a deeper dive into these topics. What we're going to do in this session is present some information, and then we're going to turn to conversation to explore the subject a little more deeply. We invite you to be part of the conversation as well through some online activities throughout and during the call-in portion of the program towards the end. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We're very fortunate to have with us two well-known figures who write and speak about poverty in America. Dr. Stephen Pimpare is Senior Lecturer in the Politics and Society program and a Fellow at the Scarcity School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire, where he writes and teaches about poverty, inequality, and economic security. He's the author of the book, A People's History of Poverty in America, and he has lent his expertise to the AmeriCorps VISTA program for several years. He's not just an academic, but a former practitioner with a wealth of on-the-ground experience too. Stephen spent many years helping soup kitchens and food pantries in New York City manage their scarce resources and better serve their clients. Also, we're delighted to have with us Linda Tirado. Linda is a writer and speaker on a range of poverty and class issues. She first gained national attention a few years ago when a blog post of hers went viral and millions of Americans read Why I Make Terrible Decisions or Poverty Thoughts. Linda has written many pieces since, most notably the book Hand to Mouth, Living in Bootstrap America, which is a powerful and influential chronicle of her own life in poverty. So to get this conversation started, I'm going to turn first to Dr. Stephen Pimpare. Stephen?
Thank you, Andy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am very glad to be here and hope you are as well. So we hear a lot today in the news and on social media about how some of the safety net programs that benefit poor Americans and the ways in which they function. And some of this attention, it seems to me, is focused on how beneficiaries supposedly take advantage of the system and misuse these benefits. And it can sometimes come with criticism of the decisions that people living in poverty are making. And it seems to me also a tendency to want to tell poor people how they should be living their lives. So what we're hoping to do today is to consider some of the more common criticism that people make about supposedly irresponsible decision-making in poor and low-income households, to try to make sense of those behaviors, and then to finally think about how all of this might apply to your own service. So before we get started in earnest, you saw a question on the screen with an invitation to enter your thoughts before we began. Here's that question again. If you didn't get a chance to respond earlier, there's an opportunity to respond now. And we're interested in hearing what you yourself have seen people living in poverty do that you have thought of as unwise or irresponsible? Or perhaps what have you heard other people identifying as behavior that they have criticized or judged? And while we wait for folks to weigh in or weigh in again, Andy, will you just remind folks how to participate?
Sure. So if you don't see the chat panel on the right side of your screen, look in the upper right corner. You'll see a little speech bubble icon and the word chat. Click on that. It'll open the chat panel. You can type in your response and click the send button. Make sure it says send to all participants so that others will be able to see your contributions. And if you're on a mobile device, a tablet, or a smartphone, you're going to need to click on the Participants tab from the menu. And then within the participant screen at the very bottom, you'll see the option to chat with everyone. All right, so we've got a lot of responses that came in earlier and many more coming in now. Stephen, one I noticed early on, someone mentioned people doing bad things over and over as if they don't want to better themselves, something that they had heard about.
There was also a comment earlier about people choosing to have children when they have scarce resources themselves. We're seeing a lot in this more recent spate of responses. We saw a couple of folks talking about cigarettes, a couple of folks talking about buying lottery tickets, unhealthy eating habits.
Spending SNAP resources, maybe splurging on steak or lobster is one that was noted a few times earlier on. And a number of comments here about SNAP benefits. Yeah.
Sorry, we also saw earlier, I noticed a couple of folks talking about using payday lenders instead of more traditional banking. Someone also was noting spending money on what they identified as the luxuries of hair, makeup, and nails, and fancy purses.
There was a comment earlier, too, that people wouldn't be poor if only they would get a job, if only they worked harder, or if only they didn't have so many children.
Yeah. There's also, I know, a strain of comments earlier and in this round about people talking about lack of knowledge, that if perhaps people understood better the ramifications of their decisions, perhaps they would act differently or behave differently. Okay, so anything else that you've seen come across your radar that you think is worth drawing attention to before we move on?
Yeah, well, in addition to all of these sort of negative views, there have been a lot of folks posting really thoughtful comments about, you know, maybe someone wasn't poor when they bought that purse and they held on to it and taken good care of it for all these years, so it still looks nice. And you know, just the whole idea of not judging other people, because we don't know their situation, and it's impossible to know how they may have come to have access to that car or that cell phone or that purse, or what their current circumstances are. So kudos to everybody for looking at this from many points of view.
Yeah, terrific. So that feels like a lovely foundation. So why don't we go ahead and move on. So I think that the range of observations that we've had an opportunity to look through from your fellow VISTAs are common in lots of ways, and we're seeing some examples here on the screen of relatively recent news stories. But I think the question for us today is, what do we make of them? And we're hoping that we can offer you some substantive knowledge and some empirical data to go along with some firsthand perspective on these kinds of questions. Now, in my experience, complaints about poor people's behavior are especially common around the SNAP program, what we used to call the food stamp program, and I will use those two phrases, SNAP and food stamps, interchangeably. So in the interest of time only today, we're going to focus a lot of our attention initially on SNAP as a way to try to sort of crystallize what it is that we're doing here. Now, it may be, if we can move on to the next slide, that part of why so much of this attention focuses on SNAP is that even with the move away from the actual food stamp coupon, and you can see one of those there on the left, to the electronic benefits transfer card that states now use, and you can see a collection of those in that image there on the right. Either way, you can still often tell in the grocery store who's using a benefit card instead of a credit card or a debit card. So it may be simply that we judge the spending of SNAP households more because there's more opportunity to do so. It's easier since their spending can be more visible. Now, before we think about that spending, we want to make sure that everybody has under their belts just some basic information about the operations of the food stamp or SNAP program to begin with. So I want to turn to just some key information about how the program functions, some of which may be familiar to some of you. So as you can see right here, food stamp eligibility is tied to income, and that's at about 130% of the poverty line. Now, you all know from your pre-service orientation just how low that line is. So even at 130% of the poverty line, you must be quite poor to be eligible for food stamps. Most households need to meet both a gross and a net income test, and that's pre and post taxes, right? But a household with an elderly person or a person who's receiving certain types of disability payments may only have to meet that net income test. So as the USDA says about requirements for the program, in general, in their words, people must meet work requirements in order to be eligible for SNAP. These work requirements include registering for work, not voluntarily quitting a job or reducing hours, taking a job if offered, and participating in employment and training programs assigned by the state. Now, in addition to that, able-bodied adults who don't have any dependents are required to work or to participate in a work program for at least 20 hours a week in order to receive benefits for more than 3 months in a 36-month period. Now, we should also note that some groups may not be subject to these requirements, and this varies in complicated kinds of ways, but the exceptions tend to be children, certain categories of seniors, pregnant women, and people who wind up being exempt either for reasons of physical disability or mental health. So all of that is a fairly long way of saying that you must be quite poor indeed to receive food stamps, and you are likely to be required to work if you are deemed able to work. So further, contrary to what I think some people think, if you look at the public discourse around these issues, benefits are low, and you can see that here. They are meant and were always meant since the creation of the program to be a supplement, even though they can constitute the full food budget for some poor families who don't have any other resources. So now if we look at the next one, this is showing us again from the USDA themselves what you can and cannot use those SNAP benefits for. So you can see the list on the left. It's pretty much basic staple food items in the grocery store: breads and cereals, fruits and vegetables, meat, fish, poultry, dairy products, along with, and this is something that I think is less typically on people's radar, you can also use SNAP benefits to purchase seeds and plants that will produce food that you can eat. And that, as you might imagine, is much more typically used in rural areas where there might be greater access to plots of land where you can engage in such kind of grow your own food work. And if you look at that column on the left, right, you see the beginnings of some basic categories of things that you cannot by law use SNAP benefits for. So beer, wine, liquor, cigarettes, any kind of tobacco item. You can't use it for pet food, soaps, paper products, any kinds of household supplies, vitamins, medicines. You cannot use SNAP benefits for diapers or for feminine hygiene products. Although you can, just as a footnote there, you might be able to get certain categories of formula for WIC, and WIC is actually fairly broadly used now. About half of all newborn children in the United States of America wind up receiving formula through the WIC program. There is some overlap there with the food stamp program. It's also worth noting that the USDA says that you can use SNAP for soft drinks, for candy, for cookies, for snack crackers, and for ice cream. And going back to a comment that Andy highlighted earlier, you can in fact use your SNAP benefits for seafood, for steak, or for bakery cakes, right? One last point on this, because this does sometimes come up. You cannot get cash back from SNAP except under the following circumstances. If you are getting both TANF, that's the cash welfare program, mostly for women with children. If you are getting both TANF and SNAP benefits, and you're in a state that put them on the same card, if you are buying what you're buying with the with the TANF portion of your benefits, you can, only under those circumstances, get cash back. All right, so let's now just quickly sort of look at how households do, in fact, use those SNAP benefits. So as you can see here, right, the top three categories by expenditures for SNAP households were, first, meat, poultry, and seafood. Second, sweetened beverages, and then third, vegetables. Now, if we look at non-SNAP households, we see that those categories were meat, poultry, and seafood, again coming in at number 1. Number 2, vegetables. And number 3, high-fat dairy or cheese. Sweetened beverages, in this case, ranked 5th. So a couple of things just to highlight there, and we can go back to this later. Both SNAP and non-SNAP households spent a greater proportion of their total expenditures on meat, poultry, and seafood than they did any other category. That is, most households, whether they're SNAP households or not, are spending the bulk of their food budget on protein. Both of those groups spent more money on fruits and vegetables than they did on prepared foods, and both groups spent more money on sweetened beverages than they did on milk. So there were no major differences in the expenditure patterns of SNAP and non-SNAP households. And I think this is worth emphasizing as we think about the kinds of judgments that we make or that other people make. No matter how we wind up categorizing these data, about 40 cents of every dollar of food expenditures by SNAP households was spent on basic items, meat, fruits, vegetables, milk, eggs, and bread. About 40 cents spent on cereal, certain kinds of prepared foods, dairy products, rice and beans, and that remaining 20 cents of every dollar was spent on sweetened beverages, desserts, salty snacks, candy, and sugar. Now, this is one study. There are lots and lots of studies. They all show the breakdown is slightly different, but the basic pattern is consistent across the research. SNAP households may spend as much as 20% of their benefits on what we might want to call junk food. So, given all of that, why is it that you think that poor households spend any money at all on these things? So, Andy, will you once again remind folks how to weigh in on this question?
Sure. Just as a reminder, please use the chat window, not the Q&A. If you don't see the chat, look in your upper right corner. You'll see the speech bubble. Click that. The chat will open. If you're on a mobile device or a tablet, go to the participants screen from the menu and look at the very bottom. You'll see chat with everyone. So folks are weighing in fast and furious.
Terrific. Like it, cheaper, easier, addiction, cheaper, whoa.
Everybody loves it. Everyone does it,
poor
or not poor.
Easy. Subsidized, that's an interesting question we might return to later. Longer shelf life, cheaper. Good
easy access, convenience.
Consumerism, less expensive. Sugar is addictive. Health food is more expensive. It's what they know. Access and exposure. which seems to me sort of a bit of combining the education and the advertising bits. It's delicious. Excuse me, somebody says some people find it delicious. Tastes better. Easier to prepare. Go for the joy you can get, says Elsa.
Food deserts. It's sometimes the only thing available in certain locations or communities.
Quick calories, lack of education. All right, we'll give it just a few more seconds, and we've got one more exercise we want you to engage in before we bring in Linda to weigh in on these questions. Okay, as you continue to respond to that, why don't we go ahead and move on. And I'm going to ask you to think about the policy implications of this. And you've got two choices here, right, across the dimension. On the one hand, should the SNAP program even further restrict the ways in which people can use their benefits, say, by forbidding the use of SNAP benefits for soda? Or on the other extreme, right, should we entirely remove all restrictions from the program and or just give people cash and let them spend it however they want? So it looks like folks are already weighing in here, including Linda. Terrific. Andy, will you tell folks who may not know what they're doing here, how to put their own arrow in on this spectrum?
Sure thing. So in the upper left corner, you'll see what looks like a marker. If you click that, it'll open a toolbar down the left menu, and the very top tool is the arrow tool. Click on that arrow and then click anywhere on the screen, and that'll place your arrow. If you want to move your arrow, just click somewhere else, and it will move you over. So feel free to use all the vertical space. You don't have to limit yourself to the little bar there, so we can get a sense of just how many of you are where. And the screen certainly is filling up. We've got a lot of folks really spread all over.
I'm going to say, I'm looking for a pattern there, and if I'm honest, I'm not sure that I see one.
Yeah, you know, maybe it's a little bit thinner on the left side where it says further restrict, but a lot of people in the middle and a lot on the right for sure.
All righty. Yep, and a couple of folks weighing in saying they see it's looking a little less crowded on the left as well.
Yep, and some additional comments there.
Yeah.
Which is nice.
All righty. So I think everybody at this point has had a chance to respond. So I would like to, at this point, bring in Linda Tirado. Linda, first of all, welcome. It's so nice to have you here today. Linda, are you with us?
And maybe your line has been muted.
It's possible.
Okay, now we hear you.
Linda, welcome.
Hey. Oh, good. Hey, what's up? Am I doing the thing? I thought I'd do myself.
So I'm wondering if, before we get you to weigh in on this with your own thoughts and your own perspective, will you tell everybody just a little bit about yourself and maybe a bit about your own story before we focus in on these questions?
Yeah, it's super simple. I worked in the food service industry and the service industries generally in hospitality for about 15 years. Got really angry one night at somebody who was wrong on the internet, corrected them, said, if you have not been poor, you can't possibly understand the financial, social, and emotional ramifications of it. Next thing you know, a bunch of people read that, and then they let me write a book, and now I get to yell about empathy and compassion for a living, which is pretty actually fantastic.
So let's give you an opportunity to do precisely that. So you've seen, some data here that seem to suggest that some people with very low income and few assets are receiving SNAP benefits and spending maybe 20% of their scarce resources on items that a lot of people might think of as foolish. And you've seen some of the comments that our participants have made here. Tell us a little bit about how you think about these questions and these issues, and maybe what you can say to help us understand what's going on in poor and low-income households as they make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, well, the first thing that I always try to tell people is you have no idea what that person's day is like. One of the things that stuck out to me, because I was on and off food stamps in a couple of different states, depending on how low my income was, always working, but sometimes on SNAP. You know, you would buy a steak for your wedding anniversary, and somebody would lecture you about your poor food choices as though lean meat isn't just the thing that we get yelled at to eat all of the time. And so you get caught in this kind of paradox of, well, did you want me to eat healthy or did you want me to eat cheaply? Because those are different things in America. And if you very rarely can have both. You know, so as far as restricting those decisions, the question is, well, what value are we using to restrict them? In Wisconsin a couple of years ago, the legislature got into an argument over whether SNAP should be applied to sharp cheddar cheese or just mild cheddar cheese, because there were certain kinds of cheese that you see were morally and or nutritionally different to the point that they would actually use the legislature's time on it. And so when you get down to that kind of parsing, the question really is, what are you doing that for? And is it a punitive measure to try to discourage people from using the program, or are you actually effectively administering those government resources?
Mm-hmm. What about all of that money going to sugary drinks, though? I mean, surely there's not a health argument to be made there, right? I would just point out, sir, that sugary drinks involve juice. Juices are sugary drinks. Now, given that the majority of, like, the size, I don't know that it's the majority, that would be Stephen's area, but the number of SNAP households who have small children, the idea that you would count juice as somehow nutritionally the same as, like, full sugar Coca-Cola is somewhat misleading when it comes to what do we consider sugary drinks. But fair enough, right? But what about the sugary drinks? I mean, is that something that in your mind should be off limits to folks receiving SNAP benefits?
I feel like if you're going to give people money to buy food, you should give them money to buy food and not nanny them. Nobody that's poor is stupid enough to think, hey, you know what's going to be a great health decision for my long-term, longevity? I'm going to drink nothing but Coke and eat nothing but Funyuns and Doritos for the rest of my life. Like, that's not a good plan for a long-term health solution. But when you're looking down a life where you're going to die of hypertension at 55 or 60 anyway, the short and long-term decision-making processes kind of flip. So then you're looking for, okay, well, what's going to open up those dopamine receptors? What's going to put me in a slightly better mood? What sugar hit can I get that's going to get me through the next few hours of my shift? Like, I used to eat in a couple of hour chunks where whatever would give me the most energy would be the thing that I bought. It wasn't necessarily the most filling or the most, helpful, but whatever would literally get me through my day if I ate it was what I bought. So you wind up with a lot of fillers, you wind up with a lot of sugar, you wind up with a lot of carbohydrates.
I mean, it sounds like you're also describing something that is a mix of the rational and the emotional in terms of why you choose one thing over another. Yeah, is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, so on the one hand, you have things like shelf stability. Like, my favorite thing in the world is fresh raspberries, but off season, they're, $7 a half pint, and even in season, they only keep for a few days in your fridge. Now, if I'm working 2 different jobs and I don't know what day I'm going to actually be home to enjoy what is spoiling in my fridge, I'm going to buy only shelf-stable products unless it's a special treat.
Yeah. And what about that emotional piece? And I've got Oscar here saying that the emotional is rational, which I suspect you might agree with.
Entirely. If you ask a human to live without emotions or without coping with negative experiences, you are asking them to stop being human. People can't just shut off. I'm having an awful day. I would like a nice thing to counterbalance that or to offset that. It's very basic human needs, same as, entertainment, same as tactile touch and love. And those things on Maslow's hierarchy are very frequently not thought of. Like, are how healthy will you be when you're in your 40s or 50s or 60s is a very far thing away from a 35-year-old mother of 2 who's trying to feed her children right now and trying to, survive without either getting jailed for punching a boss or an errant customer or hospitalized for going fully insane. And if it's a little bit of Ben and Jerry's that gets you from that moment of frustration where you can't tolerate it to that moment of, okay, fine, I can go another day or week or whatever it's going to be, then, you know, what is the value of that ice cream? And is your long-term health actually the goal here, or even the primary concern? And I think people frequently don't understand that it's such a short versus long trade-off, poverty, being poor of any stripe. You can either do what works now and it will screw you in the future, or you can do what's good in the future and hope you got it worked out in the short term.
I think that's beautifully put, and that feels like a terrific segue. If we can move on, we've got the next slide. There's actually, it turns out, a very large and growing body of academic research on this very topic, decision-making, how we as humans make decisions generally, and how that decision-making process may function differently in a world of scarce resources or insecurity. And that research fully supports everything that Linda just communicated by way of her own experience. We know that living in poverty is typically, for many people, living in a constant state of stress, right? You're always worried about, are you going to get through the day, are you going to get through the week, are you going to get through the month if you're really lucky, and what is it going to take to do that? And that stress literally has physiological effects. It has effects on the brain that we now have sophisticated sort of hard science techniques. We can actually see what's going on in people's brains. It operates less efficiently, less effectively when it is under that constant state of stress, that cognitive load. Right, and you know this a little bit. If you're having a really, really bad day, everything feels a little more difficult, right? And you feel a little less able to sort of pause and think through clearly and maybe rationally. If you're living under that state of cognitive load, it is much more likely you are going to make suboptimal decisions that maybe you wouldn't make under another set of circumstances. There's another bit of this that I want to highlight before we move on, and that is it's another bit of research that has demonstrated that just the stress of poverty alone can make our IQ drop by 14 points. And that's about the equivalent of being sleep deprived after staying awake for 24 hours. But, and here's the important point, when those stressors are removed, IQ rises again, right? We can literally see these kinds of physiological effects here. You can see here how high incidences of anxiety, stress, worry, and depression, how much higher all of these are among low-income populations. And if you look at the blue lines, those two different colored blue lines here, those are poor and low-income people, in particular low-income housing projects in Chicago and Portland, who are part of this particular study, compared to those, the incidences of those same mental health issues among the overall U.S. population at large. Look at how much of that stress, how more prevalent, how more common, how more constant, how more regular that is in those lower income households. So Linda, what else can you sort of offer into this discussion that either you neglected to point out earlier or that I've not brought up, or something maybe you've seen in the chat that you feel is worth highlighting or responding to?
You know, I think there's an awful, and it's actually a minor quibble. I'm seeing a lot of they language, which always concerns me when I see a conversation about, well, why did they do this or that? And poverty is something that in the United States will affect most families at some point.
Yep.
And people will come in and out of it. It's not, you know, it's not as harsh of a class system as they have in, say, Britain. And what's been interesting to me, because I started, like, I went viral with this essay, right, and I was working at an IHOP, And then 6 months later, I'm at the White House. So it's been like this kind of sea change. And what I've noticed is when I first started out doing this new career and these talks and stuff, I would start out by saying, like, okay, guys, we all know I'm only here because I'm white and young and cute and articulate, right? Like, those are the things. And we know that were I disabled, were I 50 years old, were I a Black woman, like this luck that I have had would have been much harder to get. And something else that I frequently told people was I have not gotten any smarter since this whole viral thing happened. I haven't been to university. I haven't had time to even really read much. Like, I'm not getting any smarter. But then when I went back and I took a cognitive capability and an IQ test, I got smarter by double digits, doing things that were way more stressful than I ever have had before because they were acutely, individually stressful in nice, neat little boxes. Like, I have work crises now. It is not a life crisis. My life is not in crisis, and so, like, my brain actually has more capacity to deal with work crises, and I actually find myself making decisions that actually work out better in the long term, sort of naturally, because I sit down and go, well, what do I actually want to do? But I have the luxury of knowing that I have options, and so, like, that cognitive load.
Sorry. I was wondering if do you find people are stunned and surprised when you open your mouth and you're smart and you're thoughtful and you know things and you're able to articulate things in a fairly sophisticated kind of way? Do you find that people are surprised by that?
Oh, I caused a major scandal. Everybody told me I couldn't have possibly been poor because I used the word whilst, which is a British word, and how did a poor person know British things? And I was like, there's the internet. I read British people and I pick up words. Sorry. You know, yeah, I do get that a lot. I get a lot of people who are surprised that I can make an emotional or a moral case for what they would consider to be misbehavior. And I do that by flipping expectations. So if you want to come and talk to me about my misuse of government funds, I would like to talk to you about your misuse of your home mortgage tax deduction or your business lunches, because if we're taking public money for food, well, then let's do that and we'll have the conversation. And I think that a lot of people are shocked that I don't apologize for having been poor. I sort of think that that was by design because millions and millions and millions of people are. And if it was by design, then why should I feel ashamed of it? I just occupied a bottom rung. And I think that lack of shame around the issue is what shocks most people. So I'm like, y'all take government money too. So I don't understand why we're talking to me about my money.
That's right. I take the lead. And we think about them in very different kinds of ways, don't we, right? Sort of, you're getting a Section 8 housing voucher, probably a fraction what I just received having filed my taxes for my home mortgage tax deduction, but no one ever presumes to make judgments about how I spend my money or how I live my life.
Oh, man, the things you can deduct on your taxes that I found out about in the last couple of years. Like, you can go to a makeup store if you do TV 3 times a year, if you do 3 TV segments, which, you know, whatever, it's 12 minutes out of your whole year. You can go to a swanky makeup store and deduct 50% of the makeup that you bought that year, even if you never wore it on TV. Yeah. Because women's products like that are considered to be part of their image and their career and their presentation. So we talk about poor people getting their hair and nails done, and we are literally subsidizing wealthy women to buy high-end makeup, which blew my mind, dude. Like, and there's hundreds of things like that where, like, I got a book deal and then I had an accountant. He was like, right, this and this and this and this and this and this, like down to my underclothes. I can take 50% off of certain kind of underclothing, which, like, what do you mean we're subsidizing my lifestyle? Like.
All right, so I want to introduce 2 other topics in particular before we bring Linda back in and then get all of you in on the phones. So what we're looking at here, and this is something that a number of folks mentioned earlier on, we're going to talk a little bit about smoking. This shows us the percentage of 2 populations that have smoked in the past 30 days. And as you can see here, that percentage is much higher for adults with incomes below the poverty line than it is for adults with income at or above the poverty line. If we look at the next one, we can see the same thing here. We'll go to the next slide, please. Yeah. We're now looking at smoking rates by education level rather than by income. And again, as you see, smoking today is much more common among people with less education than it is among people with more education. Now, people with low socioeconomic status aren't just more likely to smoke, but they tend to smoke more, too. People living in poverty smoke cigarettes nearly twice as many years as people with a family income of, 3 times the poverty rate. People with a high school education smoke cigarettes for more than twice as many years with people with at least a bachelor's degree. And blue-collar workers are more likely to start smoking cigarettes at a younger age and to smoke more heavily than white-collar workers. Now, we all know the harm that smoking causes, right? This is not only harmful, it's expensive for smokers and for all of us in terms of health costs, right? But it's also expensive on its own terms, unlike soda, say, which may be bad for you, but at least is very cheap, thanks to the subsidies that some folks pointed out earlier. But you can now pay up to $15 a pack in some places for cigarettes. So we're going to come back to this and try to make sense of this in a moment with Linda, but I want to look at just one more thing, and that is something else that people talked about earlier, and that's lottery tickets, right? It's another seemingly irrational and irresponsible behavior, right? It's risky, it's expensive, and it's disproportionately concentrated among poor and low-income people. The poorest third of households buy half of all lottery tickets in the U.S. And people who live in poor neighborhoods buy the most tickets. Now, they're also advertised more in those low-income neighborhoods, too. So, let's bring Linda back into the conversation. Linda, why on earth would people do this, right? Are they stupid? Are they irresponsible? Are they delusional? How can we explain
I'd be smoking right now if I weren't sitting in a friend's house. Like, I get nervous. I smoke a lot. Look, I mean, so practicalities, when was the last time mental health was on the budget for low-income folk, right? So you're talking about self-medication. What does a cigarette chemically do to your brain? What does it chemically do to your body? What sort of chemicals does it release? And what you find is that when you're smoking and you're low in a lot of chemicals and a lot of energy, right? And I'm not a science person, so go look the science up yourselves, y'all. But when you're smoking, you actually feel better. You actually feel better. And for me, secondly, there was the fact that if you work at a crappy job, smoke breaks are a way you can walk away from that. Non-smokers don't get like 5 minutes at random. Like, that customer's awful, I'm going outside or I'm going to punch somebody. When was the last time a non-smoker got to pull that line? So you find actually a lot of people pretend to smoke. Like, my husband picked up smoking when he was in Iraq, specifically so that he could get a break. And so, like, between those two kind of pulling things, and then also there's not a whole lot that can be used as kind of a social adhesive in the lower classes. And some of the most interesting moments that I've ever had in my life were, hey, stranger person, can I borrow your lighter? And then you bond over, like, being the out group, right, of like, oh, God, being a smoker, it's horrible, but it's this thing. And for people who don't get a lot of opportunity to do that, there's this, like, kind of weird social thing. And the last thing for me, I mean, like, look, I was an oppositional, defiant 14-year-old when I started smoking, and I'm not going to say that wasn't part of it. It was, I do not value these things that you're telling me to value, and I do not recognize that your authority supersedes mine as to my bodily integrity. If you're going to kill me with 30 years worth of degrading low-wage work with no medical benefits, without safety equipment, I will enjoy it sometimes in a way that's also harmful. But, you know, you're not talking about, like, why does this pristine body who has all of the chance of living to 150 introduce the poison into their system? It's why do people who are already poisoned not really relatively care so much about this one in particular?
Yeah, and this in some ways connects back to the point you made earlier about the luxury of long-term thinking, and that for lots of poor and low-income folks, that just doesn't make any sense to be thinking 30 years down the road when there are too many more urgent, immediate things that they've got to focus their attention on.
And not only is it a question of time, it's a question of emotional counterproductivity. So like I actually now am kind of a ridiculously cheerful, optimistic person, except for when it comes to the state of the nation, which is out of personality type for me. I was this fat, cynical, funny chick, right? Like that was my thing. And now I'm just sort of like, you know, actually dreams do come true. Things can be great. And I realize that it's because I have the luxury of sitting around with a baseline of okay already. And so then, you know, what am I doing to get myself to the next level? Well, you know, I'm still an addict, probably still smoking, but, you know, I can now read a book or take a bath or go for a walk or any number of things that people think of as normal human activities that I didn't have access to before.
So before we bring VISTAs in a couple of different ways here, talk a little bit about lottery tickets.
Yeah, it never was my thing, but man, if that's the way you're going to get there, like, look, people call me a example of the American dream because I basically did the digital version of sitting around and waiting for a producer to discover me. But if the American dream is wait around and hope until somebody gives you a book deal, that dream is dead and gone and buried. That's a terrible dream. And so, you know, look, it's going to the education budget. Is it really? Probably not. They're going to steal it, but who's going to help politicians? They're going to do what they're going to do. In the meantime, you get, like, to scratch off a little thing, and if you get one of the complex ones, it's actually kind of fun. And, you know, maybe you win, but there is not a path to winning through hard work and gumption and stick-to-itiveness unless you happen to be lightning strike lucky already. And in that case, if we're to lightning strikes, fund education. Like, it's not, I don't gamble. I don't quite understand it, but like, I can't throw stones at it because I drink wine. You know, like that's my
and there's, you know, there's also, I mean, I think in you know, in that moment between buying the ticket and, you know, having the numbers called or scratching it off, I mean, there's real opportunity for sort of deep, rich fantasy life and maybe holding on to a little hope. It's like, you know, what would I do? What could I do? How might things be different? And it's a, you know, a $1 or a $2 ticket is a heck of a lot cheaper than other forms of escape, arguably, right? I mean, if
there's like an
ticket
entire
is $15
best-selling, no, there's an entire best-selling children's franchise about the power of buying that last candy bar based on hope and what happens if your hopes are fulfilled and what sort of person could you be then. And the trap of poverty is you can't be anything, you can't do anything, you can't become anything. But if you have something that says, look, if I just hold out, then everything that I am might come to fruition. Like, God, what if you did get that book deal? What could you become then? And you know, I never bought scratch-offs because I was a smoker and I didn't have that much money. Like, you got to pick your vices, right? But I know people who do, and that's their motivation. They love hope and they need it. And me, I was a cynical fat chick that made jokes. They were hopeful people. So, you know, I'm not going to throw stones.
Yeah, and, you know, it's always, you know, struck me as interesting that we so begrudge that hope. In some ways, it's a matter of policy. All right, so let's get our VISTAs back in the conversation. So to begin with, before we open up the phone lines in a little bit, I want to ask all of you to think a little bit about your own behavior and ask if you all engage in what other people might think of as irrational or irresponsible behavior. And Andy, one more time, just as a reminder for anybody who may have joined us late about how to weigh in.
Yeah, so we're using the chat panel to respond to this question. If you don't see the chat panel, go to the upper right corner, click on the speech bubble icon with the word chat. Please don't use the Q&A because nobody will see your response if you put it in the Q&A. So I think everyone's got it. Stephen, back to you.
Terrific. So, Linda, feel free to jump in if you see anything. And we've got vodka and cigarettes and
no, whoever
coffee.
said all the coffee, I vote with them. All the coffee.
All the coffee.
I'm with that guy.
Hot chips. I don't know what a hot chip is.
Right.
Lots of ice cream, lots of coffee, lots of Starbucks, so lots of expensive coffee.
Hello, book person. I'm with you.
Okay, ukulele. Okay.
It looks like basically everybody has the same vices as everybody else, which we're found with the data, because it turns out when you're getting drunk, whether it's malt liquor or fine Bordeaux, pretty much the same activity. Like most humans are drawn to the same thing.
Yeah. You know, and as I'm sure you know, because of the nature of the program, VISTAs are living on a stipend that is set at the poverty level. Occupies sort of this funny space, right? Because lots of VISTAs, and there's a lot of variation here, of course, but, are coming from lives that are not in poverty and we hope experiencing at least some of that in the short term, and then probably returning to their lives of not living in poverty, one hopes, down the road. But what we see here is arguably not a whole lot of difference, right? If we look at how people spend their money, I think it goes back to looking at that study of grocery stores. People who are on SNAP and people who are not on SNAP don't tend to behave in fundamentally different ways, because in some ways human needs are human needs and human behavior is human behavior.
Yeah, this is an amazing list of stuff, and it's not any different. The stuff I'm seeing is no different than what me and my friends always had. And that's really the crux of it, is why are we taking these entirely human activities for people who are raised in America and saying, well, if you do them to a certain degree, they're fine, but at a certain part, they're not. Because the trouble we really have in America is that poor people aren't wearing their hair shirts properly. They're not properly chagrined or ashamed. They're not downcast enough because you're supposed to feel bad about it.
And do you have any, where do you think that comes from? How do you make sense of that? Why we expect that kind of, that shame or that misery even of people living in poverty?
I mean, my personal theory, and I don't data, guys, this isn't science, this is just I read some history that one time. I honestly think that we haven't gotten rid of our old class systems. We've kept those expectations and mentalities of their peasants and their businessmen, and that, we have class in America, even though we say we don't, because we don't have class like India, we don't have class like Great Britain, but we do have a class system here, and structuring and keeping it together is a huge investment for a lot of people in this country. And the thing that's so insidious about it is that it's tied into so many other things. It's tied into race, it's tied into gender. Like, when you are actively working at keeping labor low and keeping wages as low as possible, you're going to set up infighting amongst those below you. And that's the game we're being played right now.
So why don't we move on to the next slide? We're going to get ready to open up the phone lines for folks. In the interim, and you've got these resources in much greater depth in the download of the slide set, with, I believe, live links to these and more. But here are just some mix of resources that we've drawn upon in putting the webinar together today. Things that I or we think might be interesting. And you'll also find in the downloadable version a full collection of Linda's writings that she has put together that essentially give you the opportunity to read her book without having to go out and buy her book, which is
sorry, they
very generous.
The links down. It's only a few chapters, but that's
okay. Still good. Okay, now before we do open the phone lines, Andy, can you talk about what it is that we would like folks to do before we give them an opportunity to talk with Linda themselves?
Sure thing. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. We want to get your feedback on this session. So we've opened a poll. You can see it on the right side of the screen. 10 easy questions. You need to use the slide bar on the right to get to all the questions. Also, if you have ideas for future topics, for other webinars, could be related to this or totally separate, we love those ideas. I read each and every one of your suggestions, and we put them to use in putting together the calendar. So absolutely take a moment, if you would, during the rest of the session to fill out that evaluation. We appreciate it greatly. And now, we do want to invite you to join the conversation with Stephen and Linda. We've given you a lot to think about, and now it's your time to weigh in. So I'm going to ask our operator, Amber, to come on the line and give us instructions for how to join the conversation by phone. So Amber?
Thank you. We'll now begin the question and answer or the comment section. And if you would like to ask a question or you have a comment, you can go ahead and press *1 on your phones. You'll be prompted to record your name, so you want to make sure that you unmute your phone. So again, if you'd like to ask a question or you have a comment, go ahead and press *1, and it will take just a moment for those questions to start coming through. Great.
And if you want to ask a question online, you can do that using the Q&A panel, which appears just above the poll. It's closed now that the poll is open, but to reopen it, click that little arrow right next to the letters Q&A. It'll reopen that, and you can send your question in. All right, so while we're waiting for folks to come in on the phone, we do have a question already from Dylan. And this goes back to the comparison of SNAP and non-SNAP households, Stephen, that you shared earlier. So Dylan asks, can you explain how sweetened beverages are ranked differently in the SNAP and non-SNAP spending, but then there was no major differences in the amount of money that those two different types of households spend? So Stephen, can you clarify that?
I'm trying to get that slide back up in front of me to look at what might have been the source of confusion in those data, and I am speaking very slowly because I'm doing a terrible job of getting that slide back up in front of me. So I am biding my time. Oh, thank you so much. There we go. And so that's the expenditure rank. And then what is the next one? If we can go on to the next slide as well. So the point, I got you. The larger point that I'm trying to make there is that we do see some differences around the edges. A couple of those categories get switched. And you know, the biggest one for our purposes is the sweetened beverage category goes from, it's what, if we can go to the previous slide, it's number 2 for SNAP households and number 5 for non-SNAP households, correct. So it's not to say that there is no variation, but if actually you were to look at this study, and we've got a couple of links both to the original study itself and to some commentary on the study in the supplementing materials, you will see there that the numbers are pretty small, so that these are differences around the edges, I would argue. So it's not to say it's not different at all, but we are not seeing these radically different ways in which poor and non-poor or SNAP and non-SNAP households behave when they go into the grocery store.
All right. Thank you for clearing that up. Next up, Patrick says, can we talk about the cost of poverty, the small costs that add up that those not in poverty do not have to encounter?
Stephen, it's you or me? Yeah, I'm in. So everything is the short answer. I once lost an entire truck because I had parked in an inappropriate place. There was construction. I was confused about fines. I was in a new city. They towed my truck away, told me if I gave them $250, I could get my truck, which I brought them on payday. But by that day, the $100 daily fee or whatever it was had kicked in. And then, like, I literally lost an entire paid-off truck over a single ticket. So there's one way of getting at it. Another is, like, the hidden cost of trying to maintain a middle-class standard when you're poor. So one example that I think I saw somebody brought up and somebody DM'd me was I'm a very white lady. And so when I talk about the cost of grooming and the cost of making my hair presentable for an employer or for what people consider to be acceptable, I'm not having to pay ridiculous amounts of money because you're not allowed to have natural hair, you're not allowed to have box braids, you're not allowed to, do all of these things. So the hidden cost is essentially, hey, we're going to ask you to look as though you are middle class, although you're not, and you don't have the resources, you don't have the credit score, you can't just live on your credit card for a month until things come together. You have to use check cashing places instead of a bank because you don't have enough money to keep the minimum balance to avoid the fee. So you pay the higher fee getting your check cash because it's $3 at one time at Walmart or $4 instead of getting, the bank. So all of these little things add up. I don't do maintenance on my cars, right? Well, the car's going to not last that extra 50,000 miles. So those things really, no, nobody talks about it. And yes, we should talk about it. And we should, frankly, sit in at the London School of Economics until they start.
Great. Thank you for that. Amber, do we have anyone on the phone right now?
We do not have any questions yet, but again, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please press *1.
All right.
Be brave, folks. Be brave. Get on the phone.
Right.
We're mostly harmless.
So next up is kind of a bigger question. Susan asks, how would you suggest we use this information in developing anti-poverty programs? As serving as a VISTA, how can they apply this information?
Go ahead. I was going to kick it back to them, but maybe Linda can not cop out on the question.
No, my answer is actually every time you go to design a program, go and talk to somebody who's going to be affected by the program to help you design it. Because if you can take one thing away from this, it's this us and them mentality that people tend to have. Like, even when you're living in poverty, you'll say them. Even if you're a SNAP recipient, like, that's a normal thing. But a good portion of the reason is that people who are self-identified as living in poverty or as, having charity assistance or whatever frequently aren't at the table, which is how the programs wind up being misrepresented and misdesigned. So, taking it forward, never develop a program that does not involve somebody who will be affected by it in the development.
I think I might add one thing to that's entirely consistent with that, and that is and this arguably is good advice for all of us in all aspects of our life, but to give people the benefit of the doubt. To begin with the assumption that, if you are witnessing behavior that doesn't make sense to you, assume it's rational, assume that it makes sense for the person you're observing or read about, and then try to understand what it is in their own particular lives and circumstances that are constraining their options, that are constraining their choices, that are making that the best option that is available to them. Now, that's not always true, right? We don't always do things that make any sense. I don't always do things that make any sense. This is part of why I've always asserted that no one should ever be held responsible for anything they do before the age of 25. I have very selfish reasons for believing that. But if we begin with the assumption that people are trying, people mean well, people are making the best of bad circumstances, if you're a caseworker and you're sitting down with a client and she has got a nasty attitude, ask yourself why that is. Right? What might be going on in her life right now that makes it difficult for her to play nice to you or for her to genuflect in the ways that we sometimes ask people seeking assistance to behave, that kind of supplication, that kind of shame that Linda has talked about, that sort of performance that we often expect of people. To sort of step back a little bit and to think about why that behavior may be the best they can do right then in that moment. And that, I think, can lead to a deeper and richer understanding of the kinds of problems we face and maybe what better solutions might look like.
Yeah, and Stephen and Linda, if I can just add, of course, one of the key principles of the VISTA program is community engagement. So in designing your anti-poverty programming and putting together your projects and and programs and resources. Hopefully, you've got a mechanism by which you can engage residents of the community, members of the low-income community that you're seeking to serve, and have them weigh in, have them help design what it is that you're building, have them help you in the process by getting feedback, letting you know what's realistic, what may not be realistic, what could work, and what might not. So hopefully.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to throw one thing onto that, Andy, is that there's a strain of stuff in economics and elsewhere called participatory action research, if you're inclined to look up such things. But what that tells, the caution that comes out of that work is to not presume that you know what the problems are or that you know what the solutions are, and that, in fact, that conversation should start by talking to members of the community and getting their own perspective on what's most needed here, what are the problems here. I think sometimes we jump a step ahead, and even if we're doing the kind of work that Andy described, going out talking to people, it's like, hey, we're thinking of doing this, we're thinking of starting up this new program that would do the following things, what do you think? Even then, I think we're starting the process too late, right? That reaching out and starting conversations with people about what they understand to be their most urgent and pressing needs and the ways in which you or your organization might be able to step in and provide that kind of assistance. It's another way of thinking about that empathy and that sort of humility in our own ignorance, and recognize that too often we make presumptions about other people's lives and circumstances that turn out not to be so well borne out.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Stephen. And also a point that you started to raise earlier in response to this question, I'm going to pick up on that, and that is to see what others on this call, on this webinar, might already be doing around this. So if you have thoughts about how you can apply what we've covered today, the kinds of issues that we've touched upon, and how you can use that in your VISTA work, we'd love to pull you into that conversation. And I'll mention now, we have created a thread on one of the discussion forums on the VISTA campus, specifically relating to this webinar. A few of you have already weighed in on that before the webinar started, which is great. And I'd like to invite all of you to do that afterwards. We've posted, and we'll post again, a link to that forum discussion in the chat here, so you can get it. And it's also part of the resource list that you can download. So all right, I think we've had plenty on this. It's a big question. Thank you, Susan, for that question. Let's move on. Amber, do we have anyone on the phone?
We have no questions at this time.
Okay. Great. Well, we've got plenty here that have come in online, so I'll get to as many of these as we can. Marcus says, could we find more viable solutions to poverty if we approach the issue from a structural issue rather than an individual issue?
I mean, short answer, yes. Yes, we could. If we stopped blaming individuals for systemic problems, we would find a systemic solution to the systemic problems. Look, you can't have 2 jobs for people who have a specific level of education, systematically shut entire classes and races and genders of people out of education for 50 years, and then wonder why it turns out a little bit unequally at the end. If you want to solve a structural problem, you have to find a structural solution. We're not going to solve cops shooting people that haven't done anything by asking them politely not to, because the problem isn't the individual police officers. The problem is the system that perpetuates that sort of thing. And so when you're talking about structural problems, you need a structural solution. And to look at the individual, to look at somebody like me, all right, I had dropped out of school, admittedly a bad decision. If you actually listen to my side of the story, it turns out to be fiscally responsible. Happened to be the age where 2008 hit me ridiculously hard. Okay, fine, whatever. But if you're going to blame me for the economy's crash when I didn't own stock, we've got a bigger problem, because you're fundamentally misunderstanding what the American economy is made up of and how it is structured.
So, Lynn, I mean, I'm going to jump in and ask my own question of Linda, if I can. How do you, to what extent do you think that that's part of the work that, how do you think about the work that you're now doing? Do you have a goal? Is it pushing toward those kinds of structural approaches? Is it simply getting people to better understand what's going on in poor and working class households? How do you think about what you do?
I mean, I straight up spend about half of my life talking to people who have never actually engaged a service worker in a real personal conversation so that they can figure out that my brain works, and that hopefully that they take that and move that forward into their supervisory positions. Because the misinformation is strong going in both directions, where people are taught, well, people who have merit in the society will rise, ergo people who have not risen have no merit. And we know that isn't true, but we all still keep pretending. And so a lot of our norms and our cultural structures and a lot of the way that we structure our economy and employment are based on this premise that meritocracy is a real thing that we practice in America. But like my own story will tell you that that is absolute rubbish, because I was not any smarter or more special in November of 2013 than I was in September of 2013. The difference was that somebody had raised me to prominence and given me that stamp of approval. So it's not necessarily merit that gets it, it's merit and luck and hard work and talent and all sorts of things. But, you know, yeah, most of the work that I do is actually just going, no, 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 I was on food stamps and I'm not an idiot. So.
Yeah, and that's urgent work.
I mean, somebody's got to tell them, I guess. I didn't know it could be news for 3 solid years. I'm still like, how am I doing this for, yeah, it sucks to be poor, and poor people aren't uniquely stupid. You know how we know? There are expensive drug rehab clinics.
All right. Moving on, we've had a few questions come in that are similar, so I'm going to kind of roll them up into one. And here's the way Michelle phrased it. She says, as a VISTA, we work with very low-income individuals. Do you have any advice for dealing with fellow VISTAs or office mates who sometimes disparage low-income individuals, or, you know, who are using the us versus them language, or otherwise engaging in sort of judgmental description of people who are low income or poor?
Stephen, you got this, or you want me to?
You want to take a stop?
Yeah, I got a real quick answer. Super quick, actually. Don't allow it. And I don't mean be rude, and I don't mean call somebody out, say, look at you and your privilege, and you're talking from a privileged position. Like, that doesn't help anything. But what you do is when somebody comes out with something that's remarkably misinformed, you go, hey, did you know that wasn't true? Or did you know that's an erroneous assumption? And then you give them facts, because nobody has signed up to be a VISTA because they don't want to learn how to help. And like, you have to understand that people are going to come at this from different perspectives. They're going to come at it from different backgrounds. Like, let me tell you the stupid things I used to ask about 3 years ago in a lot of subjects, because I didn't know any better. And like, somebody who signed up for VISTA wants to help and know. So you go, hey, you're actually wrong on this. And you don't be mad, and you don't cry, and you don't get hurt, and you don't accuse anybody. You just tell them they're wrong very nicely, because why would they be here if they couldn't handle that?
I think sometimes another strategy, and you know, this, like Linda's strategy, requires that you also then have to have your facts in order. But to say, I was struck by the comment that you just made. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that? And sort of force folks to actually, because I mean, often, you know, we live in a culture that is often suffused with anti-poor people bias in lots of ways, and it's, you know, it's sort of, it seeps right into our very marrow sometimes if we're not careful. And I think that sometimes if we simply ask people to reflect, right, to not be able to make the snarky quick comment, but to then be held accountable for it and say, talk to me a little bit about what's going on there, or what do you mean by that, or that's not been my experience, tell me why you believe that. And that, you know, the trick is, as Linda said, you you can't be rude to people and you can't call them out because that's closing down conversation, not opening up space for conversation. And ideally, you want to create a space there where you can help people come to some better understanding of humans around them. And it's tricky and it's difficult, and it's often something that you've got to be very brave to do as well. But I think always worth doing, even if it's uncomfortable and even if it doesn't always work.
Well, and I would add, too, that you have to understand that if you're in a position of authority as an administrator of a program, even if you're a volunteer or being paid poverty-level wages, people are going to look to you to tell them about what they are, because you have the authority. And if you have never lived on welfare over years, if you've never had to tell people, here's who slept at my house and how frequently, so that they can then ask you if you have an extra partner that's providing help in your house. I've had perfect strangers ask me about my vaginal health, male perfect strangers, when it was not germane, but it's on the paperwork, so we talk about it, right? Then, like, when you're used to dealing with a populace of people who is that submissive to authority because that is what was required and expected, it is incumbent upon you to remember that you are in a position of authority, and it is not your job to disparage, and it is not your job to opine, and it is not your job to mistake. It is your job to serve. It is your job to learn. And so if you can keep those goals in mind, then any mistakes, preconceptions, like any of those notions that you have, you'll find they kind of melt away as you get to know people. But you do have to remember that when you're wearing an authority of an organization, people are coming to that organization for help. And they will do what they need to do to get the help or they wouldn't be there. And it's incumbent on you to not be that guy that makes it worse for them.
You're here.
You're here. So since we've been on this topic, we've had a couple of other somewhat related questions come in. One says, do you think that making fact-based arguments when someone raises it as a moral issue, such as feeding people is objectively good, could actually undermine the point you're trying to make?
This is another one of those places where the social psychology literature tells us horrifying things. I mean, the first response to that is you cannot necessarily reason someone out of something they didn't reason themselves into. And that I think I find it useful to figure out whether you are talking to someone who is open to persuasion and whether you are talking to someone who is not, because you need to conserve your own emotional resources around these issues as well. But the other challenge that we confront is that the psychology literature tells us that if someone deeply holds an idea, right, something that is sort of deeply embedded into their identity, and this often means their political ideology, that it's not just that it's difficult to change their mind, it is that we've got a long line of experimental research that shows that the more that you produce evidence to rebut their belief, the more deeply they hold on to that belief. And some of what we think is going on here is people getting defensive, right? And there's sort of this cognitive dissonance as I hold this idea, and yet you're showing all of this evidence to tell me that it's wrong, that it's wrong, that it's wrong. That undermines this thing that I have always thought, and that's uncomfortable, and that's weird, and I hate that, so I'm just going to close down. And people wind up actually getting even more entrenched in that belief. The problem is that we don't have magic solutions for how to break through to people. I think that it's creating space for conversation, it's finding opportunities to maybe subtly challenge those assumptions. I think that, you know, that you can't, you know, I mean, I think we don't often give enough credit to the moral argument. I mean, it's not necessarily rational persuasion, but to say to someone, look, I'm not interested in judging the behavior of people. I think that humans, by virtue of being human, have the right to food and everything else is secondary. That can also be a useful and productive conversation if they are willing to deny access to food as a human right.
I would actually add a little bit on that as far as the moral persuasion. I don't ever bother with facts, because facts are a thing you can look up on Google. You can feel free to spend your whole afternoon looking at facts. The thing that I always go for is, cool, are we going to talk about how we are spending the public money we receive? Great, let's get out your tax returns, and we'll have a chat about how my money was spent versus how your money was spent. Because, and a thing that I found actually that connects with people is if you can say, well, literally what is the moral difference between a tax refund for a specific business purpose, including food and entertainment of clients and those sorts of things, what is the moral difference between that and SNAP? What is the moral difference between that and disability? Is it or is it not government money coming back to you through a program as a stimulus? And if so, are we going to value stimulus as the problem, and what are we going to do there? And if you take people into that kind of not even fact but moral-based imagining of, well, what exactly is it that the problem is, then very frequently I found that people will come out of it and be like, oh my God, we all take public money. Maybe we should just not be jerks to each other. And that kind of perspective comes on, because a good portion of the problem we have is our definition. We think of welfare as public money, but we don't think of tax rebates as such, and they are exactly the same kind of economic stimulus.
All right. Thank you, Linda, for that, and Stephen as well for all the information you've provided. We have a few questions we weren't able to get to, but we do have one more activity for our participants, and that is it's a chance to reflect on what you've learned in this session. So we're going to move forward to the next slide to get your thoughts on what you gained out of this session. So Stephen, back to you.
I think I would like to just sit and be quiet and allow folks a moment to reflect and maybe offer their thoughts and hear what their colleagues have to say.
Yeah, so again, we're back to using the chat for this question. And you can see them there on the screen. How has your thinking changed as a result of this session? Do you have thoughts about how you can apply this new knowledge in your VISTA service? And what can we do? Policy changes or other thoughts or ideas about what we all can do to move ahead on this issue. So the chat panel is probably closed. You click the little triangle next to the word chat, and that will reopen for your thoughts. All right, so we've got them coming in now. The insight around tax credits being a federal subsidy similar to the way SNAP benefits and other benefits for the poor. We've got a quote here. Modernizing the face of poverty. Understanding that maybe facts are not the way to go in a conversation where you're having that tough discussion with folks who are on the other side of the issue.
I had also noticed earlier in the chat there were a number of folks having a conversation about feeling a little frustrated about sort of what the practical application might look like, and somebody, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me anymore, suggested that it would be helpful to have something like a guidebook or a toolkit, a way to sort of identify sort of concrete action steps that might be taken, and we've seen another comment come in more recently that suggests that. I think it's a lovely idea. I'm not entirely sure I know what such a thing looks like.
Yeah, and I noted earlier as well some disappointment that some of our VISTAs or some of our colleagues, aren't where we would hope they would be in terms of thinking on some of these issues and views and opinions, or their use of language. So it's clear that we always can do better, and we've all got something to learn, no matter where we are at any point. So I think we're all in the same boat there.
I mean, and I would put out there too that these kind of spaces are where you learn to have those conversations. There's nothing wrong with using the wrong vocabulary or not being, as forward thinking or not being as aware of the data as you would hope to have been. Because the point is that if you're trying, you're already doing better than 97% of the people out there. So then it's just a question of becoming comfortable with the data and becoming comfortable with the arguments to the point where you understand their relevance in the world that you live in and not this world called America that you happen to live most of your life in. Like once you realize that this is the country that you live in, this is reality. So there's really nothing wrong with having things to learn because we've all got that. It's a question of, you know, are you forcing other people to deal with the ramifications of your having not learned yet? And I think that that's an important thing to kind of piece out as well.
Yeah, very well said, Linda. Thank you. And with that, we are at the end of our time together, so I will wrap us up. I again want to thank our guests, Dr. Stephen Simper from the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire, and Linda Tirado, an independent writer and speaker. And thanks to everyone who participated in this session. Production assistance was provided by Bethany DeSablin and Joanne Lau at Education Northwest. We hope you can join us for an upcoming webinar in May. We have Ace Your Next Job interview coming up on May 11th, and then Demystifying Stakeholder Engagement on May the 23rd. Please visit the webinars page of the VISTA campus to register for either of these sessions. Remember to keep the conversation going on the forums on the VISTA campus, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.